After everything I've been through, I certainly deserved a happy ending. Sadly, I don't believe those exist anymore. I thought getting kidnapped was the worst experience of my life. Turns out, he wasn't done with me when the ransom was handed in. Before I get into any of that though, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you don't, a monster will visit you in your sleep. That's actually how all of this started, with a stupid urban legend. One day, my best friends and I were reading stories online about local ghost stories. We came across this one about visiting this bridge late at night. Legend has it, if you go there at midnight, you'll see the ghost of a boy. We were about 13 at the time, and that stuff sounded so cool to us. Without our parents' permission, we decided to go out and try it. The three of us stayed up all night, and to our surprise, someone did jump out and grab me. At first, I really thought it was the ghost of the murdered boy, but this was no ghost. Some boy, who couldn't be much older than us, dragged me away. My friends were screaming. He threw an envelope at them and told them to give that to my father. The money better be in the designated location by 5 a.m. If not, well, you won't be very happy. Do not call the police or else. I was so scared. My father was very famous and wealthy, but I never thought I'd get caught in the middle of such a scandal. My dad paid the ransom and then he just disappeared. We never got a good look at his face because he had a surgical mask on. He put me in a car and blindfolded me. Next, we drove for the next few hours. The kidnapper kept apologizing. It was so weird. Was this guy stable? So many questions flew through my mind. How scary would it be if my dad didn't answer my friend's knock at the door? What would he do if the cops were called? Lucky for me, those were questions I never had to answer. At one point, my kidnapper stopped the car and told me to brace myself. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but before I had time to think, he pushed me. Next, I fell onto grass. It wasn't soft, but I didn't really get hurt. I heard the car driving off, and I took off my blindfold to see I was in the middle of a parking lot. A few minutes later, my father drove up in his car. The kidnapper had texted him the details of where to find me once he escaped. He called the police to try and catch the kidnapper, but he was nowhere to be seen. Everything was dark when he kidnapped me, and he was wearing a surgical mask, so I never got a good look at his face. Plus, I was blindfolded most of the time. The only thing I could remember was his deep voice. I was so scared. I didn't leave the house for weeks. I went to therapy for a long time and even had to redo the whole school year. I could not stand the dark anymore. I never left the house at night at all. I constantly thought I saw him around all the time. At first, I thought I had my trauma under control, but it became apparent it was consuming me. One time, my friends tried to convince me to come out dancing with them. While we were on the dance floor, this guy started to dance next to me. He wasn't doing anything weird at all. He was actually super polite. I felt bad, but I was just so uncomfortable. He tried to whisper something in my ear, and he got so close to me. I don't know what came over me, but I just saw my kidnapper in the surgical mask. I punched him right in the face, and everyone stared at me. The guy was my friend's cousin, so she was super angry at me for giving him a black eye. After that, she stopped inviting me out anywhere. She ignored all my calls and apologies. Finally, I got a call from another friend who felt bad leaving me out in the cold. I was so relieved when I saw the call from her, but it only made me feel even worse. She told me that I was out of the friend group until I could act normal. I asked what that was supposed to mean. She told me I was being crazy. They had all been gossiping about me and said I spent too many years grieving kidnapping. It was just a few hours in a stranger's car, Mandy, she said. It's not like you died or anything. Having someone call out your insecurities like that? She was right in a way. I felt so guilty for acting the way that I did. I found it very difficult to be around guys since the incident. See, I went to an all-girls private school and had virtually no contact with any guys at all, except my father. In fact, I barely saw anyone at all except for my friends. Without them, I was afraid I'd fall into an even darker space. I begged them to hang out with me again, but she said they weren't so sure. We were adults, and at 19, and almost all of my friends had boyfriends. If I couldn't hang out with guys without having a freak out, they wanted nothing to do with me. You can come back in our group on one condition, she told me. Prove to us that you can be around a guy. Her solution was that I needed to find a boyfriend. This would be better for everyone as I would stop fifth wheeling and ensure I could stay behaved. I agreed because I was desperate. But how was I even supposed to do that? Even if I didn't actively avoid boys, there were none at school or anything. My closest chance of meeting a guy would be approaching someone in the supermarket. Now, my standards are pretty low, being my selection is limited to a grocery store, but one day, when I was out shopping, I saw this super hot guy. Like, I am talking model-worthy. He was tall and built. He looked like a boy band member. I kind of stalked him for a while, following him aisle to aisle and peeking at him from behind shelves. Part of me wanted to run up to him and steal a kiss. The other was a little petrified. I awkwardly watched him from afar, weighing my options out. I looked around the store and saw the other eligible bachelors. I decided there was no way I was letting such a hottie go. I was going to ask him out myself. I approached him and let him know that I was quite interested in getting to know him a little better. He looked at me and quickly looked away, very flustered. He ran out of the store. I thought it was kind of attractive. Maybe he was just as nervous as I was to talk to a girl. I chased after him and yelled at him to wait. I followed him up to the car, explaining that I didn't mean to scare him off. I'm sorry, I need to go. You! I exclaimed in a panic. That voice! The way he apologized, I was immediately flashed back to the kidnapping that had ruined my social life. It was him! I can never forget that voice. He left everything in his car and pushed it away from him and moved towards me. I now know where my internal fears were coming from. As the attractive boy came at me, I met his eyes. Without the surgical mask, it was difficult to recognize him. But now that I heard his voice apologize, I knew this was him. I quickly turned to run away, but he grabbed my arm. Before I got the chance to scream or anything, he pushed me into his car. Next, he leaned in and told me I had to be quiet or else, and hand over my phone. I did what he said. He popped my phone in his pocket and got in the driver's seat. Next, we were driving somewhere. I was so scared of what he could do to me, so I just sat very still in the passenger seat and looked forward. We didn't say a word until he stopped at this shack in the middle of nowhere. My mind was racing. I was again just a 13-year-old waiting for her dad to pay the ransom. I was shaking. It was like my deepest nightmare. When we went inside, it didn't look like the torture chamber I was imagining. There were no knives hanging from the ceiling or a woman tied in a corner. Instead, it looked like he lived here. He instructed me to sit on the sofa, and I followed his orders. I heard a loud pop and quickly closed my eyes and covered my head. "Don't hurt me!" I yelled. "What?" he asked, looking confused. "Look, I'm not going to hurt you. I just can't have you going to the cops." I asked what he planned on doing to me then. Holding me hostage? Killing me? He looked even more shocked and put his hands up. He told me to calm down and he would just explain everything. He told me this was his home and he had something to show me before I called the cops on him. He showed me another room where this woman was lying in bed, hooked up to a bunch of beeping machines. He explained that the money he got for our ransom was all for his mother's very expensive cancer treatment. He never intended to hurt me, but he found no other way of getting the money. His shifts were long and hard, but he barely made enough to cover his rent. In fact, he already spent all the ransom money on her first treatment, and he needed more money for additional surgeries. Jeff talked about his mom, and I don't know why, but he just got even more attractive to me. He was so kind and funny, and he had a real reason to have kidnapped me all those years ago. He too was haunted by the mistakes that he had made in desperation. He had actually been wanting to talk to me and formally apologize for anything that happened. But he always chickened out. I was completely lost in thought when we heard violent banging at the door. "Open up, it's the police!" He immediately turned at me and panicked. "If they take me away, if I'm not here to take care of my mom?" he started to say. Just then, the door busted in, and there were 4 police officers and my father. "Daddy, what are you doing? You're embarrassing me!" He told me that one of his friends was at the store and saw my suspicious exchange with Jeff. They immediately called him thinking I was in trouble. And when I didn't answer his many calls, he used the tracking device in my phone to find me. I immediately jumped to Jeff's defense and said that I was perfectly fine. We were just talking. My dad was very skeptical. He said he'd never seen the boy in his life and doubted he was one of my friends judging by his house. He asked me why I got into his car all alone. "Because he's my boyfriend," I yelled out before I could think of anything else. I made up a fake story on how we had just finished an internship and we met once at the store. I said I had to keep it a secret because Dad was smothering me. "I'm 19. You can't tell me what to do anymore." This was partly an act, but there was some truth to it. It took reconnecting with my kidnapper to get me to confront my father. My father got very embarrassed. and the police looked very annoyed. "Oh, well, we'll talk about this later, Mandy," my father awkwardly said as he slipped through the door. When we were finally alone, I frantically apologized to Jeff. I had no idea what had gotten into me. It was just the first thing that came to my mind. "Us being in a relationship was the first thing that came to your mind?" He laughed. "Well, I owe you one. Seriously, anything." I told him he could start by driving me home and giving me my cell phone. I now saw I had a lot of missed messages, most of which were from my father. I read through them on the drive back to my house. I started getting a sinking feeling in my stomach, partly because I didn't feel safe driving with Jeff, also because it seemed my little white lie spread pretty fast. My father had been very worried, so called all of my friends asking where I was. When it all ended, he called them all back to ask about my boyfriend. I got countless messages from my old friends asking me to meet that weekend to talk all about Jeff. Most important of all, I got a very nice message from my father, saying how proud he was of me working past my problems and apologizing for intruding tonight. He said he was worried I was never going to have a normal life because of what happened. As I got out of the car and we were ready to bid our farewells, an idea popped in my head. "See you, Mandy. Thanks again, really." Jeff laughed. "Wow, 3 hours is the shortest relationship in my life." "Actually, Jeff, there is something you can help me with." I asked him what he thought about prolonging our arrangement a little bit longer. I think I had a solution to both of our problems. I explained to him the problem with my friends and me, needing a boyfriend to hang out with them. I told him that if he acted like my boyfriend, I would pay him some money to keep up the cancer treatment and I wouldn't go to the police. Plus, this was probably good for my mental health, right? He was very happy about this and we exchanged numbers. I introduced Jeff to my friend group that weekend, and they loved him. We told our fake story again, and we laughed about all these inside jokes. It was actually really nice. Like, I knew the entire thing was fake, but part of me was all wrapped up in it still. We continued meeting like this a few times with my friends and father. The weird thing is, the nightmares even stopped for a bit. I had somehow convinced myself it was all real. One day, after he dropped me off, I realized I was comfortable being around him. This was a breakthrough for me. I went from punching random guys on the dance floor to calmly sitting in the car with my ex-kidnapper. He turned to say goodbye, and without thinking, I just blurted those 3 words out.
Hi, I'm Annie, and I can't recall a single moment of my life without being with my sister. My sister Emily has been sick since she was a child. Even though our family can afford a full-time caregiver for her, I was the only one who took care of her. You might be wondering why my sister could just drop down and die if I left her side. Well, she has chronic kidney disease and severe anemia that requires constant blood donations, and the only person she can get that blood from is me. I'm surprised I've got any blood left, to be honest, and let's not get started on the number of times I've fainted. But I never complained about it. Not once. Emily is my best friend, and I would do anything for her. But sometimes it was a bit weird, because to put it bluntly, she was my only friend. I don't even know what it's like to have friends. People thought that we were weird, like that first time I took her to a support meeting. I was holding her hand nonstop, and when she stood up to introduce herself, I stood up with her. I heard someone whispering that we looked like a couple, and the others started laughing. After the meeting, we went together to the toilet, and the same people were watching us. "She's my sister, all right?" I shouted. When I looked at Emily, I noticed she was crying. My sister was very sensitive. That night, I hugged her and promised that I would never leave her side no matter what. The next week at our meeting, I left Emily to go to the bathroom for 1 minute, but on my way back, I got the fright of my life. My sister had disappeared. I started screaming her name. Everyone looked at me like I was insane, but suddenly, I saw her body lying on the floor in the next room. Was she dead? Ben, the guy in charge of the meeting, was sitting with her. He told me to relax and that she was okay. He called an ambulance and said it was on the way. It took us to the hospital, and he came along. Ben was very sweet, actually. He waited in the room with me and never left our side. The doctors told me that my sister's blood pressure had dropped and that she can be released in a couple of hours. Ben invited me for a cup of coffee while we waited. He then asked me, "So what's the deal with this weird relationship that's going on with your sister?" I didn't feel like answering his question, so I put my head down and tears started running down my cheeks. Then I felt his hand touch my chin. He lifted my head up and dried my tears. He said it was okay if I didn't want to discuss it, and he just gave me a hug. He cheered me up and we started chatting about random stuff. He was actually very cute, and before I realized it, he was flirting with me. And I kind of liked it. I felt him leaning in like he was about to kiss me. But then I heard a voice shout, "What do you think you're doing, young lady?" Ugh, it was my mom. I was surprised that she remembered she had a sick daughter and came to check up on her. I told Ben that I'll see him later to save myself the embarrassment, and I went with my mom. She seemed more upset about seeing me with a boy than the fact that her other daughter was in the hospital, but I was used to it. For some reason, I wasn't allowed to date, and my parents were very strict about it. After that, I thought about Ben the whole week, and eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I Googled his name, found his number on the chronic kidney disease support website, and texted him. I had to do it when my sister was sleeping, or otherwise she'd ask who I was texting. I hid my phone under my pillow and waited for a reply. I could barely contain my excitement when I heard my phone buzzing. We started texting back and forth, and he asked me if we could meet for a proper date. I so badly wanted to say yes, but I couldn't go without my sister. But then he said he'd make a plan. So at the next meeting, there was a guest speaker, and Ben asked me if I could help him prepare some tea and cookies for everyone. My sister said she'd be okay, and so that's how I found myself alone in a kitchen with Ben. The moment we were alone, he didn't wait and just leaned in and kissed me. I felt like I was in a dream. We started talking, and I felt like I could open up to him. I told him about my situation, what my parents had taught me, that sisters should be there for one another all the time, and how that's the only way I know how to live. Ben just looked at me and said, "But what about you? When do you ever do anything for yourself?" But I couldn't reply. I had never truly thought about myself before, because thinking about myself felt selfish. The following day, I woke up to some bad news that shattered my world. My sister was transferred to the hospital, and the doctors told us that her kidneys were not responding to the medication anymore. One had completely failed, and if she didn't get a donor ASAP, she will die. I sat there holding her hand, sobbing. Our parents, on the other hand, smiled calmly and said, "Why, we already have a donor. Annie will happily oblige and give her sister one of her kidneys, won't you, dear?" They went on and asked how soon it could be done. I was gobsmacked. They didn't even ask me. For all I knew, they might have signed me up for a complete organ donation. "Sure, doc, take my kidneys. Take my liver. What else do you need?" My mom wasn't even looking at me. She just asked what I needed to sign and when they could schedule us in. But the doctors stopped them and turned to me and said, "Annie, is this okay with you? Do you agree to this?" My mom butted in and said, "Yep, of course she agrees." And then I just lost it. For the first time in my life, I stood up and shouted, "No, I don't agree. I don't agree at all. You never ask me what I want." Then I stormed out of there, shaking in a fit of tears. My mom shouted after me that I was a selfish brat, but I didn't care. That was the first time I'd really left my sister. And I almost turned back to get her, but I wanted space. Actually, I wanted to see Ben. I called him and asked if we could meet. I didn't even look back to see if my parents were coming after me. I met Ben at a cafe and told him everything. On the one hand, I wanted to save my sister's life, but on the other hand, what about my life? It felt like all I did was look after her. Ben said he'd never come across any case like this before, and that my parents weren't treating me right. He said he felt suspicious about it all. He started asking about how my parents treated me when I was a kid. I told him that I thought they were like all other parents, super strict and not particularly interested in me. Then I mentioned that they never even kept any photos of me, that I'd looked, but only found photos of my sister. He said that something seemed wrong. He's been working in this field for a while, and he never encountered such a weird family. He said he could look up my sister's files and find out what was going on. I asked if I could come with him because I didn't want to go home. Well, I was in for a shock. He looked up my sister on the records and then said something weird to me. "Annie, your sister's file shows no sign of her having any other siblings. It's like you don't exist on her records. You're definitely related, right?" I assured him we were, but then he looked in my records, and from the expressions on his face, I knew something was wrong. "Annie, it looks like you're not her biological sister. You're adopted." I couldn't believe it. That had to be a mistake. All I knew was my family. I had no memory of being anywhere else or living with any other parents. I felt like my world was crumbling around me. He showed me my file, and sure enough, 17 years ago, when I was a 1-year-old, I was adopted. I wanted to puke. How could my parents lie to me all these years? Ben drove me home, and as I walked up the path, my mom came running out and asked where the heck I'd been and said my sister needed me. I just waved my file in her face and said, "Explain this!" She looked like she wanted to faint. Then the truth came out. After she gave birth to my sister and realized she was sick, they decided it was too dangerous to have any more children, as both their genes meant their kids were at a higher risk of having a chronic condition. So they decided to adopt a baby so their little girl wouldn't be all alone in the world. Because they were so rich and donated loads of money to the orphanage, they were allowed to choose which baby they wanted. Their only request was that the baby has the blood type O. Ah, yes. Now the truth really came out. They adopted me to save their precious little girl's life. They'd used me all these years and didn't care if I got sick from donating a kidney, as long as their own flesh and blood daughter survived. I couldn't bear to stand there another second. I ran out in a rage, and my sister sat crying on the sofa. Ben said I could stay with him, and we could even file a report about my parents. I was so angry, but all I could think about was my sister. What if she died? Was I really the only suitable donor? Now that I'd had a taste of freedom, I didn't want to go back to being with her 24/7, but the thought of life without her was unbearable. I knew what I had to do. But the following week, I got a text from my mom saying, "Your sister is about to die. She won't accept you as a donor. You are the most selfish person I know." So I called the hospital and asked them to pretend I was an anonymous donor and try to get my sister to accept it that way. They said she'd refused mine because she'd felt so guilty for everything I'd been through. But maybe this anonymous one would work. The surgery was set up for the next week. But then a shocking event took place. The hospital called and said that my sister's body was shutting down and that she needs the donation ASAP. I hurried to the hospital. My sister was already in the operating room unconscious. They prepared me for the surgery, and after a few hours, it was done. I asked the doctors to put me in a separate room because I didn't want her to know that it was me. The surgery left me very tired. I don't know for how long I was sleeping before I opened my eyes and saw my sister in my room, sitting in the hospital chair. "It was you, wasn't it? They told me it was an anonymous donor, but I know you too well, sis." I started crying immediately. I've never been so happy to see my sister in my life. The transplant was a success, and I don't regret it for a second. Ben and I have said to my sister she can stay with us whenever she wants. And the best part,